Hello, friends. So, we had another viewer question today, and it is, how do you manage to keep a handle on things and not overreact or lose your cool? And initially, I was like, is this a joke? Does anybody keep a handle on things and not overreact and lose their cool? Because I feel like sometimes, or a lot of the time, that I am like a overreacting mess. So, I really had to think about this. And it really depends on the situation. And I'm probably going to tell a couple stories. And yeah, so we'll discuss that. And as an overall presentation to the world, I like to think, or I've been told, that I project like a calm, peaceful demeanor, even when things are kind of falling apart. I like to keep things peaceful, keep people, I don't know, try to be the calm face. Oh, here's Hedda. She's going to join us today. We'll see how she cooperates. I like to be, the face of calm in panic. That's what I like to be. But a lot of times internally, it's a totally different story. I may be calm and quiet and doing whatever to try to keep the environment feeling nice. But internally, I might be completely the opposite. And I had to think about, like, how did I learn to do this? Part of it, um, part of it may come from 20 years of working behind the chair in a salon, and you have to present yourself a certain way. And of course, dealing with the public and dealing with people, you're going to get all kinds of people coming in, and some of them aren't exactly peaceful or happy. And you might have some situations where there's confrontation or just an angry, difficult person, and you need to maintain your composure. Not that I can't be tough or authoritative when I need to be, but a lot of times you just have to be calm. Now, around my family or the people that I'm very close to, which is very few people, people that see me in everyday life, I'm not as good at keeping all of that in. I remember one time when my daughter, she put her car in the ditch on a winter day, and she did not want to tell me because she knew I would freak out, panic, start asking a million questions. She thought I would be mad at her. I wouldn't be mad at her, but she of course told her dad first because he can handle it better than I can in her estimation. And sometimes when it depends, like I said, it depends on the situation. If people are arguing or there's anger going on, I tend to shut down a little bit. So then I might freak out in a way that I just kind of run away or start crying sometimes. Um, and you'd have to go back and watch, I don't know if it was my last video or the one before that, INFJs in conflict, to get an idea of what happens to me in conflict. But other situations where I was required to maintain my composure and not overreact, I can be really good at that. I can be very good at giving the people around me what they need at the time. But again, internally, it's a very different story. And I have two stories that have come to my mind. The one was, and I hope he doesn't mind me sharing this, and he might, but it's okay. It's something that everybody, well, lots of people know. My husband had a heart attack a few years ago. And while it was happening, because I watched him have it right in front of me, and while it was happening, I, just maintained this just very peaceful, kind of almost angry. Like I almost had to make myself, the word stoic comes to mind, but that's not the right thing. It was more like authoritative. Like I had to start being bossy and tell this person to do this thing and this person to do that thing. But I knew in that moment that I couldn't freak out because, dad's going through that and my children can't have mom falling apart at the same time. I had to kind of draw back into myself and put aside what I was feeling in the situation and be something else for everybody else. So even when he was in the hospital, I had basically had no emotional reaction to it. I was very cold. I was very almost clinical. I asked the questions that needed to be asked. There's a fly. It's wintertime. I asked the questions that needed to be asked, but had no emotional reaction really at that time. I did have a complete and total meltdown later when it was, safe and he was home, and I probably then my brain decided it was safe to do that. But in the moment, I almost had to put everything that I felt aside, and I couldn't even figure out what I felt until much later. And I definitely had a lot of fear in that time and grief, and the being faced with the mortality of my husband. And my reaction to that was to just shut everything off and be cold. And whether that was a healthy reaction or not, I don't know. And the other situation was when my dad died. And immediately when I got the news that my dad died, and then I hung up the phone because it was my brother calling me, I completely lost it. Completely lost it. I hadn't spoken to my dad in many years. Our relationship was basically non existent. I knew that he was getting near the end of his life because he had put in good work into drinking himself to death. But I completely lost it. So I just went in my bedroom, shut the door, wouldn't let anyone come in, and just wailed and screamed and for a little while. And then after that, I went back to that cold business, what work needs to be done self. That I'm not going to feel this. I'm not going to react, which probably would have been appropriately to react sad or devastated or bad that my father died. But instead, I just went into that okay, what do we need to do? And I'm realizing that that's a huge coping mechanism for me when I have emotions or a situation that's kind of overwhelming, is I find work to do. And when you lose somebody, there is a lot of work to do because you have to make funeral arrangements. You have to figure out how to contact everybody that needs to be contacted. You have to do lots of final things. We had to clean out his house, that kind of stuff. So there was a good solid week of work to do. And in that week, I had no feelings about it externally. I did have feelings about it internally, but I almost went into a different part of my mind that it wasn't even real. And then for me, because I like to bottle up well, I don't like to, but that's what I do. I like to bottle up that stuff and not feel it. It comes out later. And it comes out usually in a dysfunctional way. So I know there was one day that I completely flipped out on my husband because I felt like he wasn't reacting properly to how I was reacting. And he was very, very supportive. So the poor thing got the brunt of everything that I had held in. And I ended up yelling at him, which I don't do very often, but I ended up yelling at him and later apologized. And he was just fine with it. He handles that stuff just fine. But the other thing that happened in that situation is, I had to go into the bank. And this is a few weeks after Dad passed because we had to wait for all the paperwork to come through. And that takes a little while. So I had to go into the bank and close his account. And I also had several of his paychecks because for some reason he had 2 uncashed paychecks. And then we also got mailed a paycheck. of his. So he had 3 paychecks that had to be cashed, and then he had this bank account which had, some money in it. Not a lot of money. We're not talking about thousands and thousands of dollars, less than 5G. So it wasn't a ton of money. And Dad had no debt, and Dad had really no estate or anything. He rented the home he lived in for like 20 years or whatever. So it was a very simple closing of things. So I went into the bank, um, all dolled up like I always am, very professional. I had all my paperwork in order. And I thought it would just be a simple thing: sign paperwork, have them look over. They're going to take a copy or whatever of, death certificate, this other paper that I forget what it's called, but it basically says that I'm the heir and I have right to, handle his financial affairs. And my brother had also signed that because he was out west, so he couldn't do it at that time. Well, what ended up happening is the gal that I talked to went and got her manager in the bank, and they basically accused me of fraud, even though I had all the paperwork. And rightfully so, I got extremely angry. And I was a mess coming in there, even though I had put this, stoic, cold, external, show on for the world, and I had put myself together like a professional woman, and I got very mad. And they had gathered all my paperwork and taken it, his paychecks, everything. And what I ended up doing is kind of exploding at them. It's not something I do very often. I could probably count on one hand the number of times I've done that. I very rarely drop the F-bomb, and that was one of the words I used, directed at them. And I did it loud enough that everyone that was standing in the bank turned around and looked. And I grabbed all my paperwork and I put my sunglasses back on and I marched my professional ass right out of there. So my husband thought it was amazing. He thought it was hysterically funny. I was crying hysterically by the time I got back in the car, and he thought it was great. But for me, I thought it was the most unprofessional, unlike myself thing I had ever done. And I was really embarrassed. I ended up getting it settled very easily by going to a branch of the same bank in the town I live in where they know me, and it was no problem. So it was fine. But the majority of the time, when something happens, especially if I'm out in public, when something happens that incites me emotionally for whatever reason, I am able to maintain a calm, cool, stoic attitude. And I think part of that is definitely from working in the public, because you get trained trial by fire and how to deal with people. And then, I grew up in a large family. I was always the peacemaker, the mediator. And I generally find something to do when there's conflict going on. One other time, I was at a friend's house. We were having coffee with a bunch of other ladies, and 2 of the friends started arguing. And I mean, really arguing, like they were mad at each other. And I just immediately got up and started cleaning my friend's house because I was not going to engage and I didn't want anything to do with it. But I also didn't want to go home because it wasn't the host's fault. So I didn't want to leave. So I ended up vacuuming her entire house by the time it was over. And is that healthy? Probably not. But that's what I do. And then, but internally, it's an entirely different thing. And I have learned the hard way not to react immediately to things, because a lot of times if you react on your first impulse, you're going to hurt somebody and then in the end hurt yourself. So it's better to, as they say, count to 10, take a deep breath, try to think things through, but don't think about it too much, because when I think about it too much, then I make it worse than it is. So it's one of those puzzles. But for the people that know me really well, it's a facade because internally a lot of times I'm a mess and I'm not cool and calm and collected, but I can present that pretty well. So anyway, there's the answer to that question. I don't know if that is even helpful to anybody, but that's how it works for me. And I appreciate you guys. Have a beautiful day. Live and love out of the way you were created.